Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Isaiah chapters 2 through 4. Isaiah chapter 2, verse 1 introduces a new section. You can tell by the way it begins. The word which Isaiah the son of Amos saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. So that's the title of this next section. A word comes, and Isaiah is going to be speaking that word. Now, the first thing we ought to notice as we begin in verse 2, and notice how it says, Now it will come about in the last days that the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as the chief of the mountains. It will be raised up above the hills. All the nations will stream into it. We're going to go through that. But notice, first of all, that Micah chapter 4, beginning in verse 1, has almost identically the same several verses. It's word for word. We go on to Isaiah 2:3, and many peoples will come and say, notice the difference, a slight difference. Micah chapter 4, verse 2 says, many nations instead of people will come and say, but they're saying the same thing. Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us concerning his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. It continues the rest of verse 3, for the law will go forth from Zion, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. When you see Micah saying even the word, the Hebrew says the same thing. That's just the translator, perhaps putting a slightly different spin on it. Really means the same thing. Verse 4, and he will judge between the nations and will render decisions for many people. And notice in Isaiah it says, and they will hammer their swords into plowshares. Micah says, then they will hammer their swords into plowshares. You say it the same way in Hebrew. There's no distinction there. So it's the same thing. Nation will not lift up sword against nation, and never again will they learn war. Micah 4:3 says, and never again will they train for war. That's the translator doing it. In the Hebrew, it's exactly the same. Now, there's a rule of study when you see two passages that are in parallel, that are very close, that two authors do not independently express thought alike. And so, did Isaiah copy from Matthew? From Micah? Did Micah copy from Isaiah, or did they both copy from an earlier writing that is now lost to us? And the answer is we don't know. I'm not sure that it even really matters. So let's go back to verse 2 then. Now it will come about that in the last days, and notice that phrase, the last days, not in the last day, singular. There is a distinction there. In the last days, plural. That's going to be a phrase we see a number of times. The first time it appears in the Hebrew text, it's not translated this way, sometimes in certain English translations, but it goes all the way back to Genesis, I think chapter 49, where a prophecy is given by Jacob about the last, in the last days, these things are going to happen. And so when we see that phrase, the last days, it looks not just to the immediate future, this looks far to the future. This looks to like the next age. And notice, in the last days, the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established. Now, that mountain theme is something that we see all throughout the scriptures. In Matthew alone, there's 7 different mountains that are mentioned. And I can't help but think, for example, of the Mount of, the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus gathers disciples and other people with him. And notice how the passage says, the mountain of the house will be established as the chief of the mountains and will be raised up above the hills, and all the nations will stream to it. And think about how Jesus gives his teaching of the Sermon on the Mount. And we read at the end of the sermon, and people gathered to hear that. And not only did they gather, but because it's written in the scriptures, there have been people all over the world that have gathered in that figurative sense to hear the teachings of Jesus. The mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as the chief of the mountains. And notice, it will be raised above the hills, and all the nations will stream into it. Now, that idea of being raised, there have been some that thought, well, maybe someday in the future, the city of Jerusalem and the mount on which the temple is located is going to be raised up high, and it's going to get taller, and it will be up in the clouds. I don't think that's what it's talking about. Although I'm not saying you can't necessarily take this aspect literally. You see, Jesus himself talked about how the house of the Lord, the temple, Jesus said, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Now, he wasn't talking about the physical temple of wood and stone that was there in Jerusalem. John, very conveniently, John chapter 2, tells us that he was speaking of the temple of his body that was crucified and died and was buried and that rose again. And notice, it will be raised above the hills, and all the nations will stream into it. And of course, I think of the event that took place in Acts chapter 2 at Pentecost, where there were representatives of all the nations that had come, yes, to that physical temple there in Jerusalem. And of course, how do I know they were representatives from all the different nations? Because they were speaking the languages of all those different nations, and then heard those Christians who'd been freshly filled with the Holy Spirit, heard them speaking in languages from all those different nations. But it's not just the earthly temple, the physical temple. I think this is Jesus as well, because Jesus, remember in John chapter 12, he said, if I be lifted up, this is in chapter 12, verse 32. Verse 32. If I'm lifted up from the earth, I will draw all men to myself. Jesus accomplished this promise. Jesus fulfilled this prophecy. And so all the nations will stream to it. He goes on in verse 3, and many peoples will come and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord. And notice how it says, to the mountain of the Lord, and then in good Hebrew parallelism, to the house of the God of Jacob. It's the same place. That he may teach us concerning his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. Has not Jesus done that? He came, yes, to save us, yes, to give his life as an atonement, but also to teach us how we are to live. And Isaiah continues, for the law will go forth from Zion, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem, and the church that began there in Jerusalem has spread out. That's what Jesus told his disciples to do. He said, go, make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them and teaching them. And that has taken place. And that word of the Lord has gone out from Jerusalem. And so he, again, calls them to go to the mountain, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us concerning his ways. Verse 4, and he will judge between the nations, and will render decisions for many peoples, and they will hammer their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. And Jesus called people to do that. Now it's interesting that when he calls that hammering swords into plowshares, you look over to Joel chapter 3 and verse 10. There in a time of war, the people were told, beat your plowshares into swords. Notice how it went the other way in the days of Joel. And your pruning hooks into spears. And this is a throwback all the way back to the days of the judges. And in the days of the judges, the Israelites did not have the knowledge and ability to work with iron. And so there were no blacksmiths in the entire land of Egypt. If a Israelite wanted to go and get his axe sharpened, or his hoe, or his pruning hook sharpened, he had to take it down to the Philistines. I always imagine, he would go down to the blacksmith, and the blacksmith of the Philistines would take it into a back room because he didn't want to show the Israelites what he did. It was almost like magic. And he would sharpen the tool for a certain price and then give it back to the Israelite. And the Israelite couldn't get a sword or a spear, but he could get an axe, and he could get a hoe and a plowshare. And these would be the makeshift weapons in time of war that the Israelites would use. Now later, once we get to the days of David, that changed. But the expression and the remembrance of those quote unquote good old days continued. And so there's coming a time when they'll hammer their swords into plowshares. In other words, they'll take the weapons and turn them to peaceful endeavors, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not lift up sword against nation, and never again will they learn war. And Jesus taught that, but we're not there yet. Frankly, all you have to do is pick up a newspaper or go on the internet, and you'll see we're far from there so far. But there's coming a day when the prophecy will be fulfilled, when that peace will take hold, when he will judge between the nations, and he will indeed be the Prince of Peace. So in these first 4 verses, you have a vision for the future glory of the temple. When I say the temple, that's Jesus. But it was in Isaiah's day, still future. Jesus wasn't there yet. He hadn't been born yet. That was going to be 700 years later. As we come now to verses 5 through 9, we're going to move to the present tense. And Isaiah now gives an indictment against the present apostasy. So he goes from the future to the present. Verse 5, "Come, house of Jacob, and let us walk in the light of the Lord. For you have abandoned your people, O house of Jacob, because they are filled with influences from the east, and they are soothsayers like the Philistines, and they strike bargains with the children of the foreigners." The Israelites, who were supposed to be separate from the nations, had found themselves becoming much like the nations in many respects. And that is the indictment that's given. Verse 7, "Their land has also been filled with silver and gold, and there is no end to their treasures. Their land has also been filled with horses." And notice the repetition. The land has been filled, and there's no end to their treasures. The land has also been filled with horses, and there's no end to their chariots. In other words, they're so caught up with military things, and not just military things. Look at verse 8. "Their land has also been filled, this time with idols, and they worship the work of their hands, that which their fingers have made." They've been pursuing after secular pursuits, whether war or whether religion. Verse 9, "So the common man has been humbled, and the man of importance has been abased. But do not forgive them." Notice judgment is going to come. And so we started with a vision of the future glory of the temple, and then the indictment of the present apostasy. And now this brings us to that coming judgment, which is going to be described. Chapter 2, verse 10, "Enter the rock and hide in the dust from the terror of the Lord and from the splendor of his majesty." Now notice, how do you enter into a rock? Well, you go into a cave. And this is a picture of something that the Israelites had seen way back in the book of Joshua. Remember, in the book of Joshua, there had been those kings that had come up against the Israelites after they'd come into the land. Kings like the king of Jerusalem, and this is when Jerusalem was a Canaanite city, and the king of Lachish and of Eglon. A number of different kings had banded together in a confederation. This was in Joshua chapter 10. And they had come up against God, against God and God's people. And this was the instance where God gave Israel a victory, but then God himself entered into the battle. This is the time when Joshua called for the sun to stand still, and we read that great stones fell from the sky. And there were more killed by the stones than there were in the actual battle. And at the end of the battle, the kings, the pagan kings, had gone and hidden themselves in a cave. That's the picture here. Enter the rock and hide in the dust from the terror of the Lord and from the splendor of his majesty. Verse 11, "The proud look of man will be abased, and the loftiness of man will be humbled, and the Lord alone will be exalted in that day, for the Lord of hosts will have a day." No, remember, the Lord of hosts, that's the Lord of armies. That's a military call. "For the Lord of hosts will have a day of reckoning against everyone who is proud and lofty, and against everyone who is lifted up, that he may be abased." So notice that we begin with that idea of being abased, and then you go from there to loftiness, and the Lord alone is going to be exalted, and then he's called the Lord of hosts. And notice how we saw loftiness earlier. We see it again against everyone who's proud and lofty. And again, that such a person who is trying to be lofty, trying to be proud, trying to be lifted up, that he may be abased. This proud one is going to be abased. An interesting pattern that develops in the midst of this call of judgment against the proud. Verse 13, and it will be against all the cedars of Lebanon that are lofty and lifted up, against all the oaks of Bashan, against all the lofty mountains, against all the hills that are lifted up, against every high tower, against every fortified wall, against all the ships of Tarshish, against all the beautiful craft, all those things that you look up and represent lofty people, these lofty pillars of nature. You say, well, ships aren't really pillars of nature, but to the Jews, they were sort of out there because the Jews were a land-loving people. Against all those things comes God's judgment. Verse 17, the pride of man will be humbled, and the loftiness of men will be abased, and the Lord alone will be exalted in that day, but the idols will completely vanish. Men will go into caves. Here, remember how we started the section? We were talking about caves going into the rock. Men will go into caves of the rocks and into the holes of the ground before the terror of the Lord and the splendor of majesty when he arises to make the earth tremble. You actually see a picture of this in Revelation chapter 6. Revelation chapter 6 is that chapter that has these seals that are broken, and you've got the four horsemen, and then there's souls under the altar. But you come to the sixth seal, and the kings of the earth are saying, they're calling for the rocks to come and hide us, cover us. Same idea of when you go into a cave, because great is the wrath of the Lamb. And that's the picture that's being given here. Verse 20, in that day, men will cast away to the moles and the bats, those things that go underground, their idols of silver and their idols of gold, which they made for themselves to worship, in order to go into the caverns of the rocks and the clefts of the cliffs before the terror of the Lord and the splendor of his majesty when he arises to make the earth tremble. Stop regarding man, whose breath of life is in his nostrils, for why should he be esteemed? The one you ought to esteem is the one you will eventually esteem, and that is the very majesty of God himself. Now, I want to give an outline now of what we've been seeing. We started off with glory in the mountain of the Lord back in verses 1 through 4. When we come to the end of this section, we're going to see a glory again. The branch of the Lord is going to be beautiful. Next, we have this indictment of the present apostasy, and we're going to see an indictment when we get to chapter 3 and verse 16. That's going to match up. We're coming now to, we just saw the judgment day of reckoning. That was verses 10 through 22. Likewise, in chapter 3, verses 13 through 15, we're going to see another judgment where the Lord judges. But right now, we're coming to the pivotal point, the central point in this entire 3-chapter section. And it's going to focus on the leaders of Jerusalem and note their rebellion against God. And so chapter 3, verse 1, for behold, the Lord God of hosts is going to remove from Jerusalem and Judah. Remember how chapter 2 started. It was the word of the Lord against Judah and Jerusalem. Now he's going to remove from Jerusalem and Judah both supply and support, the whole supply of bread and the whole supply of water, the mighty man and the warrior, the judge and the prophet, the diviner and the elder. Notice it's not targeting the common people, but the ones that are looked at as leaders. Verse 3, the captain of 50 and the honorable man, the counselor and the expert artisan and the skillful enchanter. Verse 4, I will make mere lads their princes, and capricious children will rule over them. Those leaders are going to be abased, so that those who were not leaders are ruling over the leaders. Verse 5, and the people will be oppressed, each one by another, and each one by his neighbor. The youth will storm against the elder, and the inferior against the honorable. When a man lays hold of his brother in his father's house, saying, you have a cloak, you shall be our ruler. Notice, what is your your criteria for being a leader? Well, you have a cloak. Okay, I guess that's it. What's your criteria for leadership? Well, you have a voice. You have you're able to talk in front of people. Not well, but that's it. You're a leader. And these ruins will be under your charge. He will protest on that day, saying, I will not be your healer, for in my house there's neither bread nor cloak. Remember, the cloak was the thing that allowed somebody to be a leader in that not very good leader. You should not appoint me ruler of the people. Notice that's what he's saying. I'm not qualified. For Jerusalem has stumbled and Judah has fallen because their speech and their actions are against the Lord. And this is really the heart of the matter, to rebel against his glorious presence. And so we see that the leaders and the people too, because people tend to go where leaders lead, are in rebellion against God. Notice, against his glorious presence, against his face, against his presence. The expression of their faces bears witness against them, and they display their sin like Sodom. Remember how chapter 1 likened Jerusalem and the people of God to Sodom and Gomorrah, and the same thing is happening here. They display their sin like Sodom. They do not even conceal it. Woe to them, for they have brought evil on themselves. Say to the righteous that it go well with them, for they will eat the fruit of their actions. Woe to the wicked. And notice here, he speaks to the righteous first, and then to the wicked, for it will go badly. For the righteous it will go well, for the wicked it will go badly, for what he deserves will be done to him. This is the judgment of God, to bring that judgment, that fair judgment, that righteous judgment. And notice it goes both to the righteous, but also to the wicked. Oh, my people, their oppressors are children, and women rule over them. And that's a sign of their weakness. They've been left to the point where even a child is able to oppress them. Oh, my people, those who guide you lead you astray and confuse the direction of your path. Sometimes God judges by sending bad leaders. And now we come, notice we have, we've seen the glory of the mountain of the Lord, the indictment, the judgment, the leaders. Next we see the judgment again, where God's going to judge them, verses 13 through 15. Verse 13, the Lord arises to contend and stands to judge the people. The Lord enters into judgment with the elders and princes of his people. And here's the judgment. It is you who have devoured the vineyard. The plunder of the poor is in your houses. What do you mean by crushing my people and grinding the face of the poor, declares the Lord of hosts. And so he calls the leaders to account, and he judges them for their terrible, for their hostile, for their oppressive leadership. And finally, we come to that section, the indictment. That this is we saw pride before, we saw apostasy before. We've seen pride mentioned, but it's the present pride that's going to be underscored, beginning in verse 16 and going into chapter 4. Moreover, the Lord said, because the daughters of Zion are proud and walk with heads held high and seductive eyes and go along with mincing steps and tinkle the bangles on their feet. And notice, not speaking to the leaders now, it's speaking the daughters of Zion. It's speaking to the women. Why? Because they have in their enjoyment of things of vanity and things of physical pleasure, have also abandoned the Lord. Therefore, the Lord will afflict the scalp of the daughters of Zion with scabs. That doesn't sound very nice. And the Lord will make their foreheads bare. Remember that typically your forehead would be covered up if you were a woman. And so this is part of their shame. Verse 18, in that day the Lord will take away the beauty of their anklets, headbands, crescent ornaments, dangling earrings, bracelets, veils, headdresses, ankle chains, sashes, perfume boxes, amulets, finger rings, nose rings, festal robes, outer tunics, cloaks, money purses, hand mirrors, undergarments, turbans, and veils. All the things that in which a woman of that day would delight Notice that's all being described as being removed. Now, they would possibly think of this, and appropriately so, when invading armies would come in, and in Hezekiah's day, in Isaiah's day, they're going to see the Assyrians come up against Israel in the north and going to try to take Judah in the south. And then at a much later date, long after Hezekiah and Isaiah are dead and buried, you're going to see Babylon come and do the same thing. And in each case, when they take their captives, they strip them bare. When I say bare, they strip them naked in complete shame. But also, there's a sense in which we sort of see this when somebody dies. Yes, you see, somebody who's died, and they dress them up nicely, put them into a coffin. But all that stuff doesn't really go with you. Somebody said there's no U-Haul behind a hearse. That is, you can't take your riches with you. Someone said, but you can send them on ahead. You can invest in spiritual riches, and you can have those for the future. Verse 24, now it will come about that instead of sweet perfume, there will be putrefaction. Instead of a belt, a rope. Instead of a well-set hair, a plucked out scalp. And this is speaking again of that sort of captivity language. Instead of fine clothes, a donning of sackcloth, and brandishing instead of beauty. Your men will fall by the sword, and your mighty ones in battle, and her gates will lament and mourn, and deserted she will sit on the ground. Now, we'd been talking about women, but when you talk about her gates, this is the woman pictured as Jerusalem, or I should say Jerusalem pictured as the woman. And so the men can't just sit back and say, well, that's the woman, we don't have to worry about that. No, that's the city being pictured here. Chapter 4, verse 1, for 7 women will take hold of one man in that day, saying, we will eat our own bread and wear our own clothes, only let us be called by your name, take away our reproach. Again, this is a picture of the destitution. This is a picture of the dishonor that is brought against, and we're using that woman theme, against the women who aren't looking to be protected and treated, but they're just seeking to have a name in order for their reproach to be taken away. But now the scene changes. In the midst of that judgment and that indictment and those issues, we come to chapter 4, verse 2, the last section. It brings us full circle. We started with glory, and we're going to end with glory, but notice how we get there. Chapter 4, verse 2, in that day the branch of the Lord will be beautiful. Now, when you say the branch, that translation works. The Hebrew word is samak, and it can refer to a branch of a tree, but it can also refer to the beginning of a sprout, something that begins to sprout up. Maybe I actually got a friend he's extended family, and his name is Forrest, but he got the nickname somewhere along the line of Twig, and that works here. The twig of the Lord, or the branch of the Lord, or the sprout of the Lord will be beautiful and glorious. And the picture here is of a tree that has been cut down. And we've just been reading about how Jerusalem and the people that were supposed to be the people of God are cut down by Assyria and by Babylon and by all sorts of things. But from that broken stump, a twig, a sprout, a branch begins to branch forth. And notice the branch of the Lord will be beautiful and glorious. And the fruit of the earth will be the pride and the adornment of the survivors of Israel. Notice how there's a remnant of that great tree that had been cut down and shattered. But from that comes the branch. And of course, the branch ultimately is Jesus. and those that are connected to him find their place of life. It will come about that he who is left in Zion and remains in Jerusalem will be called holy, everyone who is recorded for life in Jerusalem. In this new Jerusalem, in this restored Jerusalem, it will be a place not of death, but of life. Life if they are connected to the one who has sprouted, who has branched forth, and who is growing into a new great tree that will cover the earth. And so we read verse 4, when the Lord has washed away the filth of the daughters of Zion and purged the bloodshed of Jerusalem from her midst by the spirit of judgment and the spirit of burning, then the Lord will create over the whole area of Mount Zion and over her assemblies a cloud by day, even smoke, and the brightness of a flaming fire by night. Now, that's language that if you're Jewish, you know that language. That's the language of the wilderness, back when the Israelites had first come out of Egypt. And notice, a cloud by day, even smoke, and the brightness of a flaming fire by night, for over all the glory will be a canopy. A canopy. And it's described in terms of a cloud by day and a flaming fire by night. That's how God led his people through the wilderness. Verse 6, there will be a shelter to give shade from the heat by day, and refuge and protection from the storm and the rain. What's the shelter? God is the shelter. Indeed, that word shelter, that word shelter is sukkah, a shelter. And the Jewish people actually had a feast of Sukkot, the feast of booths, of shelters, and sometimes we translate the Feast of Tabernacles, because God was a tabernacle, a shelter to his people. And that tabernacle, along with the cloud by day, the pillar of fire by night, signified the presence of God. When we come to the New Testament, we read of the one who tabernacled, who was made flesh and tabernacled with us, who was a sukkah with us, who was a shelter with us and for us. And his name is Jesus. But one more thing that I want you to see, when you talk about a sukkah, you see, if you ever go to a Jewish wedding, even today, back then as well as today, there will be a canopy, a shelter, a sukkah. And it represents the same thing that it represented back in the days of the wilderness. It was God's marriage canopy with his people. And here we see the truth that God has entered into a marriage with his people. Israel was his bride. Now, the way we say that in the New Testament, we speak of being the bride of Christ. It's not a separate bride. It's not two different wives. We have entered into something that was promised, that was there in the Old Testament, but now there is a greater fullness of it, as we have entered into a marriage relationship with our Lord through faith in him.